Let's begin by looking at the wide range of terms that relate to this type of consciousness. Remember that these are widely reported cross-culturally. They're reported across very significant timescales in human evolution. And so there's a lot of different words and a lot of different analysis that has been applied to them over time. These are some examples of primarily Western expressions. So you may have heard of mystical experiences. You may have heard of peak experiences. You may have heard of transcendental experiences. You probably haven't heard of something like the living flame of love or love fire as an example. Even this graphic, with as many different terms that have been collected together by these researchers, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the labels that have been applied to this. There's a huge range in the Eastern literature, for example, and while you may be familiar with some of them, like the one that appears on this graphic, samadhi, there's in fact lots of different types of samadhi and lots of labels involving samadhi that you're not familiar with, and most probably. I mean, if you're out there and you're a scholar in that area, okay, you're probably familiar with it. But for most people, it's very unlikely that they're familiar with anything other than sort of the general word enlightenment or the general word samadhi, as an example. So just a very simple scratching the surface sort of look begins to give us an idea of how much complexity is really here, how many labels people have used in trying to explain their experiences of this state. These can also be temporary or persistent, and by far most of them are temporary. Now I use the word persistent because unless we follow someone to the grave, we don't really know if their experience was permanent or not. In the popular literature that's out there, you very often see the word permanent. Someone becomes enlightened, and it's this permanent state. Well, I can tell you from a research perspective that it's not always permanent. There are people who are in these states for years and come out of them. So I prefer the term persistent because I think it's just a little bit more accurate. Other people have used sort of other terms for temporary or persistent forms of these states. Awakening versus enlightenment is one example in the academic literature. Another one is peak versus plateau. And that's Maslow's terminology. Maslow was a very famous humanistic psychologist, really one of the founders of humanistic psychology. And as we'll see very shortly, he himself experienced a transition from peak experiences, temporary non-symbolic experiences, to more persistent, or what he called plateau, non-symbolic consciousness. It's also not limited to religious or spiritual people. So while we often see these expressed in the religious and spiritual literature, in fact, atheists have also had these experiences. So they're not really just spiritual-oriented experiences. And in fact, when an atheist has it, they may be like Lester Levinson, who was a materialist, a physicist, definitely not a spiritual person before he had his experience of persistent non-symbolic consciousness, which did appear, incidentally, to follow him until he died. Now, when it happened to him, he began searching for what might be going on with him, and he discovered spiritual literature, and he began to describe his experience from a spiritual standpoint, and he did, in his writings, in his speaking, use the word God, right? So that's one direction that an atheist can head. But an atheist, there are plenty of examples out there of atheists that are in these states, that are in some form of non-symbolic consciousness, that do not go the spiritual route, that remain, in fact, atheists. So there's nothing inherent in this experience that seems to reveal God, as an example. There are people out there who can have these experiences as an ongoing part of their reality, and yet not associate them or attribute them with any sort of God or deity or religious or spirituality. The final point on this page relates to Common Core versus constructionist ideas involving non-symbolic consciousness. Now, what we're talking about here is actually a very simple debate that's gone on for a long time, and its real primary advocates today have been, in the academic world, someone named Stace and another person named Hood. Stace passed away some time ago, but Ralph Hood is at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, and is a very famous and well-known and accomplished scholar of religion who specializes in many ways in temporary non-symbolic experiences. And Katz, who is a philosopher that argues the other side of the coin. So what's being argued here? Well, Katz argues the constructionist side of the coin, and that is that a Buddhist description of their non-symbolic experience is radically different than a Christian's experience of their non-symbolic experience. And that these are two very, very different experiences. Basically, the argument is that we have to take their descriptions at face value. We can't really read more into them. We can't say, well, there appear to be common elements for both that point to a more common core or a more common underlying experience. Now, I personally am an advocate, at least right now, and I am always open to changing my mind. But right now, it seems to make the most sense to me that we are, in fact, looking at some sort of common core of these experiences. And I don't just approach this from the standpoint of description. So I'm not really in the descriptive battle up there with someone like Katz. To me, it makes sense that these have to be brain states. These are basically neurological states that we're talking about here. And they're going to have some sort of mediation with, neurotransmitters and networks that are being activated in the brain. And I just really think that there's enough evidence for the descriptions of these various states being common across time and across culture and across religion, etc., that they suggest that these descriptors are layers on top of some sort of underlying and common set of brain states. Maybe a single brain state, right? So I really think that there's some sort of neurological common core involving these. But again, that's just an idea. It's possible that these are very different states. I mentioned Maslow and that he transitioned from a peak experience, from having temporary peak experiences to having a more persistent experience. Stanley Krippner, who is very much a favorite person of mine, a friend, a mentor, and one of the most accomplished people who researches these types of things, was on a board a long time ago, sort of like a speaking board at a conference, panel, if you will, with Maslow. And Maslow, during that panel, described for him the difference between peak and plateau experiences from his own experience. And Stan actually paid out of pocket to have that transcribed and put into the scientific literature. I think it's a very, very powerful account because it comes from someone who spent so many years thinking about peak experiences, thinking about these types of experiences. And this was one of Maslow's primary areas of interest. And so to have experienced that transition himself and been able to sort of comment on it internally, I think makes it a powerful thing to go over. So I just want to read some of this. I've cut it down a little bit to keep what I think are the most important parts. But let's just take a moment and go through this.